Bethlehem did not begin as a steel town in the way people later came to describe it. For much of its early existence, it functioned like countless other small Pennsylvania settlements whose purpose was defined less by ambition and more by geography. The Lehigh River provided movement and access. Rail lines passed close enough to matter. The surrounding land supported trade and light industry. People lived close to where they worked and adjusted their routines around daylight, weather, and availability, rather than long-term plans. Nothing about the town suggested it was preparing to shape the future of American industry. When steel production began to take root, it did not arrive as a defining moment. It entered quietly as a response to demand that was growing elsewhere. Railroads were expanding westward and southward, bridges were being planned in cities far beyond Pennsylvania, and construction projects increasingly required materials that could be produced in larger, more reliable quantities. Bethlehem's early steel operations expanded because orders kept coming back, not because the town had positioned itself as a national player. The early growth of the works blended easily into daily life. A furnace added here meant a few more workers hired. A larger workforce meant more housing, often built close enough that people could walk to their shift. Small businesses opened nearby because there was now a steady group of customers whose days followed predictable patterns. None of this felt sudden. It felt incremental, like a town slowly filling in empty space without changing its overall shape. As production increased, time itself began to reorganize. Work schedules started mattering more than natural rhythms. Whistles signaled the start and end of shifts. Streets grew crowded at specific hours. Trains moved with greater frequency, carrying raw materials in and finished steel out. Local services adjusted their hours to match the flow of workers rather than the habits of families. The town adapted without discussion because adaptation was easier than resistance. What made Bethlehem distinct was not simply that it produced steel, but that the steel rarely stayed nearby. Materials manufactured in the town were shipped out to rail projects, bridges, and industrial sites hundreds of miles away. The people working the furnaces rarely saw the finished structures their labor supported, but their output quietly became part of other cities' foundations. Bethlehem was connecting itself to distant places without ever needing to understand how dependent those places were becoming. For workers, the plant represented reliability rather than aspiration. The labor was physically demanding, repetitive, and exhausting, but it paid steadily enough to keep families anchored. Skills were learned through observation and experience rather than formal training. People stayed because the work was there, and alternatives were uncertain. Over time, employment became generational, without anyone framing it as legacy or tradition. It simply felt logical to remain where income was consistent. As the steelworks expanded further, the town followed without hesitation. Housing grew denser. Neighborhoods pressed closer to industrial areas. Services became more specialized, shaped by the needs of workers rather than residents with varied occupations. The local economy narrowed gradually, not through deliberate choice, but through repetition. When the same source of income sustains a place long enough, dependence forms quietly. By the time Bethlehem steel began to attract national attention, the town had already adjusted itself around the assumption that steel production would continue. Daily routines, expectations, and economic decisions were now aligned with that belief. The company did not feel separate from the place anymore. It felt woven into it, setting the stage for the scale, reach, and responsibility that would grow next. That assumption did not feel like confidence at the time. It felt like continuity. Steel orders arrived regularly enough that planning beyond the next season seemed unnecessary. Investment decisions were made with the expectation that demand would return, as it always had. Workers arranged their lives around predictable shifts. Merchants stocked goods based on steady wages rather than growth. Nothing about the moment suggested vulnerability. The town was not asking what would happen if steel slowed, because everything in front of it suggested there was no reason for it to slow at all. Bethlehem Steel's position within the national economy shifted long before most people inside the town realized it. The company moved from supplying material to influencing how projects were planned in the first place. Engineers and contractors began working backward from Bethlehem's capabilities, designing bridges, rail systems, and industrial structures around steel shapes and delivery schedules they expected to be available. Once that expectation took hold, flexibility disappeared. Replacing Bethlehem as a supplier meant redesign, delay, and added cost, which made the company increasingly difficult to bypass. This kind of influence did not come with public visibility. Bethlehem Steel did not sell directly to consumers and had no everyday brand presence outside industrial circles. Its importance traveled through paperwork, specifications, and construction timelines rather than advertisements or storefronts. When When steel shipments arrived on time, projects progressed smoothly, and no one noticed. When deliveries slipped, work stalled far away from Pennsylvania, and the cause was often traced back to a single bottleneck inside the mill. Internally, the operation became more layered and segmented. Steelmaking was no longer a single continuous process, but a sequence of tightly coordinated stages. Raw material handling, furnace operations, rolling, finishing, inspection, and transport were managed as interdependent systems rather than isolated tasks. A slowdown in one area created pressure elsewhere, forcing supervisors to balance output, maintenance, and delivery commitments simultaneously. Coordination became as critical as production itself. With that coordination came rising complexity. The workforce expanded beyond furnace crews and mill operators to include inspectors, planners, logistics coordinators, machinists, electricians, and maintenance specialists. Each additional role improved efficiency in the short term, but added to the company's fixed cost structure. The plant could not easily reduce these layers without disrupting operation, which meant that even temporary dips in demand carried financial consequences. From the perspective of Bethlehem's residents, daily life still appeared stable. Employment remained steady enough to support long-term planning. Families bought homes instead of renting. Local businesses invested in permanent storefronts. Schools expanded facilities based on the expectation that enrollment would continue. These decisions locked the town more deeply into the steel economy, not through policy or debate, but through routine choices made possible by predictable wages. Beyond the town, Bethlehem Steel's output flowed into projects that defined modern American growth. Steel from its mills was incorporated into rail corridors that connected regions, bridges that supported increasing traffic loads, and industrial facilities designed to operate at unprecedented scale. The people producing the steel rarely saw these finished structures, but their work became embedded in systems that other industries depended on to function. This embedded role altered the company's relationship with risk. Delays and quality issues no longer affected only Bethlehem's balance sheet. They affected construction schedules, financing arrangements, and labor planning elsewhere. The pressure to maintain consistency increased, encouraging further investment in equipment and capacity. Each new investment made the system more productive, but also less adaptable. Management decisions during this phase focused on sustaining throughput rather than questioning long-term exposure. Capital expenditures were justified by ongoing demand projections. Equipment upgrades assumed continued utilization. Long-term supply arrangements reduced uncertainty while tying the company to future obligations. These choices made sense within the information available at the time, but they increased dependence on uninterrupted demand. The steelworks, once a responsive operation serving nearby needs, had become a central node in national infrastructure planning. That transition did not feel dramatic inside Bethlehem. It felt like progress unfolding step by step. Yet each step reinforced a structure that required constant motion to remain viable, setting conditions that would later make adjustment difficult once external pressures began shifting. Alongside these structural shifts, labor relations inside Bethlehem Steel were also changing, though not in a way that was immediately confrontational. As the workforce grew larger and more specialized, informal understandings between workers and supervisors became harder to maintain. Early mill operations relied heavily on personal familiarity. Foremen knew crews by name. Expectations were enforced through habit rather than written policy. As departments multiplied and shifts expanded, that familiarity weakened. Rules became more formal. Discipline became more standardized. Decisions once handled on the floor were pushed upward through management layers. This transition altered how workers experienced the job. Work was still physically demanding, but it was now more tightly measured. Output targets were clearer. Downtime was scrutinized. Maintenance schedules were planned to minimize interruption rather than worker fatigue. These changes improved efficiency, but they also reduced flexibility for people on the line. A job that once allowed small adjustments became less forgiving as coordination across departments increased. Wages during this period remained competitive enough to retain labor, which delayed open resistance. Many workers accepted stricter conditions because employment alternatives were limited and the pay supported stable family lives. The absence of immediate conflict made the system appear balanced, but beneath that balance was growing tension between production demands and human limits. Those tensions did not surface all at once. They accumulated quietly through longer shifts, tighter schedules, and reduced discretion. At the same time, Bethlehem Steel's physical footprint continued expanding. Furnaces grew larger. Rolling mills were upgraded to handle heavier sections. Power systems were reinforced to support higher loads. Each expansion increased output potential while raising the minimum level of activity required to justify operating costs. Shutting down equipment became more expensive. Idling capacity meant losses rather than pauses. The company was building a machine that needed to keep running to remain viable. These investments were rational within the context of ongoing demand. American cities were still growing. Infrastructure projects continued to be approved. Military requirements remained significant. Steel consumption showed no immediate signs of collapse. From management's perspective, expanding capacity reduced per-unit costs and strengthened competitive position. From the town's perspective, expansion meant continued employment and security. What was less visible was how this growth limited future options. High fixed costs reduced the company's ability to adapt to sudden shifts in pricing or demand. Equipment designed for specific product lines could not easily be repurposed. Labor systems, optimized for volume, were slow to adjust to contraction. The very efficiencies that made Bethlehem Steel dominant also made it rigid. Financial practices reflected this confidence in continuity. Long-term borrowing was justified by projected utilization. Pension commitments were made under assumptions of sustained employment levels. Healthcare and benefits expanded alongside the workforce. These obligations were manageable as long as production volumes remained high, but they tied the company's future to conditions it could not fully control. Beyond the plant gates, Bethlehem itself absorbed these assumptions. Local government infrastructure investments were planned around stable tax revenues. Housing stock increased with the expectation that demand would persist. Commercial districts expanded to serve a workforce that was not expected to shrink. Each decision reinforced the town's alignment with steel production, making diversification less urgent and less likely. By this stage, Bethlehem Steel was no longer simply supplying material or supporting local employment. It had become a deeply integrated system whose operations affected planning, finance, and urban development simultaneously. That integration brought strength, but it also meant that any disruption would propagate widely. The system required balance across many moving parts, and maintaining that balance depended on conditions continuing largely as they had. None of these developments felt like warning signs at the time. They felt like maturity. The company had moved past improvisation and into structured operation. The town had moved past uncertainty and into routine. Steel continued flowing outward. Wages continued circulating locally, and the system held together well enough to discourage doubts. Yet the very scale and coordination that sustained Bethlehem Steel during this period were quietly narrowing the paths available once outside pressures began to change. Bethlehem Steel's importance was never obvious to the places that depended on it most. The cities that grew using its steel did not see the furnaces, the rolling mills, or the rail spurs in Pennsylvania. What they experienced was movement that stayed on schedule, buildings that rose when planned, bridges that opened on time, rail lines that connected regions without interruption. Steel was not visible to most people, but it quietly determined whether urban life could keep expanding without friction. As American cities entered periods of rapid growth, steel became the material that set limits on everything else. Architects could design taller buildings only if steel sections of specific strength and dimensions were available consistently. Engineers could plan longer bridge spans only if load-bearing steel could be delivered in exact sequences. Rail networks expanded only if track, girders, and structural components arrived in coordination with grading and concrete work. Bethlehem Steel became valuable because it reduced uncertainty. Cities did not need to ask whether steel would arrive. They assumed it would. That assumption shaped urban planning in ways rarely acknowledged. Construction timelines were written around steel delivery schedules. Financing depended on milestones that required steel framing to be completed before funds were released. Labor crews downstream scheduled work weeks in advance based on expected material arrival. A single steel shipment arriving late could stall hundreds of workers, delay inspections, and trigger penalties. When shipments arrived on time, no one noticed. Reliability erased visibility. The steel itself flowed into many layers of city life simultaneously. Skyscraper frames absorbed thousands of tons before any glass or concrete became visible. Elevated rail systems depended on steel beams that defined alignment long before trains ran. Power stations, water infrastructure, and industrial facilities relied on structural steel to house systems that kept kept cities functioning daily. Bethlehem Steel was present in all of these projects without appearing in any of their public narratives. This invisibility extended beyond landmark structures. Ordinary urban expansion depended just as heavily on steel. Warehouses, factories, schools, hospitals, and transportation hubs required standardized steel shapes produced at scale. Bethlehem Steel's catalogs and specifications became reference points for engineers who designed with known dimensions rather than bespoke solutions. This standardization accelerated construction because designs could be reused and adapted instead of reinvented. As cities expanded outward, steel also shaped how quickly land could be converted into usable space. Rail-served industrial zones emerged where steel could be delivered efficiently. Port facilities expanded using steel pilings and framing that allowed heavier cargo handling. Distribution centers rose along transportation corridors designed to support growing consumption. Bethlehem Steel's output was embedded in these systems, shaping not just individual buildings, but entire patterns of urban growth. What made this relationship durable was not dominance through branding, but integration through function. Once city planners, engineers, and contractors relied on Bethlehem Steel's consistency, alternatives introduced risk. Switching suppliers meant redesigning connections, recalculating loads, and adjusting schedules. That friction discouraged experimentation. Bethlehem Steel did not need to enforce dependence. Dependence emerged naturally through repeated successful delivery. The scale of this influence multiplied as multiple cities expanded simultaneously. Steel produced in Bethlehem moved into projects across regions, supporting growth that reinforced itself. As one city expanded, it demanded more steel. As steel production increased, capacity justified larger projects elsewhere. The feedback loop operated without coordination between cities. Bethlehem Steel functioned as a stabilizing input that allowed expansion to proceed without centralized control. This role also affected labor far beyond the steelworks. Construction workers, engineers, inspectors, transport crews, and maintenance staff in distant cities scheduled their work around steel availability. Employment patterns downstream depended on material arriving when promised. A reliable steel supply reduced idle time and stabilized income for workers who never heard the company's name. Bethlehem Steel fed urban employment indirectly through predictability rather than direct hiring. The company's steel also shaped how cities perceived risk. Projects became larger because material availability felt secure. Developers planned ambitious structures because supply chains appeared dependable. Municipalities invested in infrastructure assuming that key inputs would not fail. This confidence accelerated growth, but it also increased exposure. The more cities relied on uninterrupted steel delivery, the more vulnerable they became to disruption. Bethlehem Steel's output did not just support cities during periods of expansion, it supported maintenance and replacement as well. Aging bridges were reinforced, rail systems were upgraded, industrial facilities were expanded incrementally rather than rebuilt. Steel allowed cities to renew themselves piece by piece without stopping operations. That continuous renewal depended on steady supply rather than occasional bursts of production. Over time, this created a quiet hierarchy of importance within the economy. Consumer-facing industries received attention and recognition. Steel producers remained background infrastructure. Yet when steel production slowed or delivery schedules slipped, the effects cascaded outward quickly. Projects paused. Costs increased, workers waited. The absence of steel became visible only when it disrupted expectations that had formed over decades. Bethlehem Steel's ability to feed cities rested on its capacity to remain predictable under varying conditions. Weather disruptions, labor fluctuations, and logistical challenges were absorbed internally to protect delivery commitments. This internal buffering shielded cities from volatility while transferring risk back onto the producer. The smoother urban growth appeared, the more strain accumulated within the steel system that supported it. This relationship between Bethlehem Steel and American cities was never formalized in policy or contract language. It existed through habit. Each successful project reinforced trust. Each on-time delivery strengthened assumptions. Cities did not plan contingencies for steel shortages because shortages had not been part of recent experience. Dependence deepened without being acknowledged. By the time steel supply became a subject of concern, cities had already been shaped by decades of reliance. Urban layouts, transportation systems, and industrial zones reflected decisions made under the assumption of steady steel availability. Bethlehem Steel had fed cities not by advertising its role, but by disappearing into the systems that allowed urban life to function smoothly. That invisibility defined this phase of the company's history. Bethlehem Steel was not celebrated by the people it supported. It was not discussed in public discourse outside industrial circles. Yet its output moved through the skeletal structures of cities, carrying weight that held everything else in place. Steel framed the spaces where millions lived and worked, and its quiet consistency made that framing feel permanent. As long as that consistency held, cities continued expanding with confidence. The steel kept arriving. The buildings kept rising. The systems stayed aligned. Bethlehem Steel's contribution remained unseen precisely because it worked, creating a form of dependence that would only become visible much later when the conditions that sustained it began to shift. By the time Bethlehem Steel entered what later generations would call its power years, the company was no longer defined by growth alone. It was defined by obligation. Contracts were larger, longer, and more interconnected than before. Steel output was tied to national defense planning, large-scale infrastructure programs, and industrial expansion that assumed uninterrupted supply. The company did not simply win work. It became part of planning conversations, where steel availability was treated as a given rather than a variable. Military demand played a central role in this phase, but not in the simplified way it is often described. Wartime production did not just increase volume, it changed expectations around speed, tolerance, and reliability. Shipbuilding programs required steel sections delivered on strict timelines. Delays could stall entire assembly chains. Quality failures could have consequences far beyond financial penalties. Bethlehem Steel adjusted by tightening internal controls, accelerating production cycles, and expanding capacity where possible, often at significant cost. These adjustments placed sustained pressure on the workforce. Shifts extended. Overtime became routine rather than exceptional. Maintenance schedules were compressed to keep furnaces running at higher utilization rates. Safety protocols existed, but they operated within a system that prioritized output continuity. Accidents were not framed as systemic failures, but as unfortunate costs of scale. Workers understood this implicitly. The job paid well relative to alternatives, but it demanded physical endurance and acceptance of risk. The scale of operations during this period reinforced Bethlehem Steel's dominance while simultaneously increasing its vulnerability. Furnaces, rolling mills, and fabrication facilities were expanded to handle peak demand rather than average conditions. This made the company highly efficient when fully utilized, but expensive to operate below capacity. Fixed costs rose sharply. Power consumption, maintenance labor, and depreciation expenses became structural features rather than adjustable variables. Management during this phase focused on coordination rather than experimentation. The challenge was not finding new markets, but meeting existing commitments. Production schedules were synchronized with downstream users whose projects depended on predictable delivery. Any deviation created cascading problems. As a result, internal flexibility diminished. Decisions favored stability over adaptability, reinforcing systems that worked well under constant demand but struggled with variability. The company's public image benefited from this alignment with national priorities. Bethlehem Steel was associated with strength, reliability, and contribution to large collective efforts. This reputation mattered when negotiating contracts and securing financing. Lenders viewed the company as a safe borrower. Policymakers saw it as an essential industrial asset. These perceptions lowered short-term risk and encouraged further expansion. Inside the plant, however, the day-to-day experience was becoming more rigid. Job classifications narrowed. Tasks were broken down into standardized motions. Supervisory oversight increased. These changes improved throughput and reduced uncertainty for planners, but they also reduced worker autonomy. Informal problem-solving gave way to prescribed procedures. Deviations required approval rather than initiative. Union presence grew stronger during this period, not primarily as an oppositional force, but as a stabilizing one. Collective bargaining agreements formalized wages, hours, and benefits in ways that matched the company's need for predictability. In exchange for labor peace, Bethlehem Steel accepted long-term commitments related to compensation and retirement. These agreements made employment more secure for workers, but they also added fixed obligations that assumed sustained production levels. The town of Bethlehem mirrored this consolidation. Public infrastructure projects were justified by stable tax revenues from the plant. Housing development assumed long-term employment continuity. Local businesses oriented themselves around a workforce whose income and schedules appeared dependable. Few incentives existed to diversify economically, because diversification seemed unnecessary in the presence of a dominant employer that continued delivering. As years passed, the very systems that had once enabled Bethlehem Steel's rise began limiting its strategic options. Equipment designed for specific products could not be repurposed quickly. Labor agreements optimized for full utilization became harder to renegotiate in response to downturns. Capital tied up in large-scale facilities reduced the company's ability to pivot towards smaller or more flexible production models. From the outside, this period looked like strength consolidated. Production volumes were high, employment remained robust. Contracts continued flowing. From the inside, the system required constant balance to function. Any disruption, whether from supply chains, pricing pressure, or shifts in demand, now had amplified consequences. The company was powerful, but that power depended on conditions remaining broadly stable. The momentum of these years carried Bethlehem Steel forward without requiring fundamental reassessment. Success reinforced existing assumptions. Expansion validated previous decisions. The absence of immediate crisis made caution feel unnecessary. Yet beneath that stability, dependencies were deepening. The company had become exceptionally good at operating under one set of conditions and increasingly exposed to risk if those conditions began to change. Pressure on Bethlehem Steel did not begin with collapse or headlines. It began with numbers that no longer moved the way planners expected them to. Orders still arrived, but pricing became tighter. Margins narrowed in places that had once absorbed inefficiency without consequence. Projects that previously assumed domestic steel now included foreign alternatives as reference points, not replacements yet, but benchmarks that altered negotiations. These changes did not feel threatening at first. They felt like adjustments within a system that had always managed to adapt. Foreign steel producers, particularly in Europe and later in Asia, began operating under cost structures that differed fundamentally from Bethlehem's. Many of these facilities were newer, built after the war with more modern equipment, and layouts optimized for efficiency rather than incremental expansion. Their labor costs were lower. Their plants were designed around specific product lines, instead of carrying the burden of legacy infrastructure. When their steel entered global markets, it applied downward pressure that Bethlehem Steel could not easily offset without reducing margins or increasing output beyond sustainable levels. Internally, this pressure collided with the company's fixed cost structure. Furnaces, mills, and transport systems required continuous operation to justify their expense. Slowing production did not proportionally reduce costs, it exposed them. Management faced a narrowing range of options. Lower prices meant thinner margins. Lower output meant underutilized assets. Both paths strained finances, but neither immediately threatened survival, which delayed decisive action. Labor agreements further constrained flexibility. Wages, benefits, and pension obligations had been negotiated under assumptions of stable or growing employment. These commitments were manageable during peak utilization, but they became heavier as demand fluctuated. Reducing the workforce was legally and socially complex. Maintaining it during slowdowns increased losses. The system was designed for stability, not contraction. At the same time, domestic demand patterns were shifting. Infrastructure projects slowed as earlier expansion phases completed. New construction increasingly favored materials and designs that reduced steel intensity. Automakers sought lighter components. Engineering practices evolved toward efficiency rather than mass. None of these changes eliminated the need for steel, but they reduced the rate at which demand grew, removing the cushion Bethlehem Steel had relied on for decades. Management responses during this period focused on maintaining competitiveness within existing frameworks. Efforts were made to modernize certain facilities, improve efficiency, and negotiate better terms with suppliers and customers. These initiatives required capital, and capital was already tied to maintaining large-scale operations. Modernization was selective rather than comprehensive, creating uneven performance across the company's footprint. The town of Bethlehem began feeling these shifts before they were publicly acknowledged. Hiring slowed. Overtime became less consistent. Some departments operated below capacity while others remained busy. The predictability that had anchored household planning softened. People noticed small changes first, not layoffs, but uncertainty. Decisions about home purchases, schooling, and local investment became more cautious. Competition also altered customer relationships. Buyers who had once committed to long-term domestic supply contracts began renegotiating terms more frequently. Price sensitivity increased. Delivery schedules were scrutinized more closely. Bethlehem Steel's reliability still mattered, but it now had to be justified economically rather than assumed. The company remained a major supplier, but its position was no longer unchallenged. Financial indicators reflected these stresses gradually. Debt levels increased as borrowing supported modernization and operating continuity. Pension obligations grew as the workforce aged. Cash flow tightened during periods of lower utilization. None of these metrics signaled immediate failure, but together they reduced resilience. The company could absorb shocks, but each absorption weakened its ability to respond to the next one. Externally, policy environments were also changing. Trade discussions, tariffs, and international agreements influenced steel pricing and availability. Bethlehem Steel operated within regulatory frameworks that evolved alongside political priorities. Navigating these shifts required negotiation and compliance costs that further complicated strategic planning. What made this phase difficult to recognize as a turning point was its incremental nature. There was no single decision that marked decline. The company continued producing, workers continued showing up, steel continued shipping. Yet the conditions that had once allowed Bethlehem Steel to dominate without question were no longer intact. The system still functioned, but it demanded greater effort to achieve smaller return. By this stage, the company was spending increasing energy maintaining balance rather than expanding capability. Decisions were framed around preservation rather than growth. The gap between Bethlehem Steel's structure and the emerging global steel market widened slowly, creating a mismatch that would later become impossible to ignore once external pressures intensified further. Alongside competitive pressure, Bethlehem Steel was also confronting internal inefficiencies that had been masked during years of strong demand. Many of the company's facilities had been expanded incrementally over decades, rather than rebuilt as unified systems. This meant production often relied on moving material across long distances within the same plant, increasing handling time and energy costs. Newer foreign mills, by contrast, were designed with streamlined layouts that reduced internal transport and simplified workflow. Bethlehem Steel could improve processes at the margins, but its physical structure limited how much efficiency it could realistically gain. Energy costs became another growing concern. Steelmaking is power-intensive, and fluctuations in fuel and electricity prices affected operating expenses directly. Older furnaces and rolling equipment were less energy efficient than modern alternatives, but replacing them entirely required capital investments that were difficult to justify amid tightening margin. Incremental upgrades improved performance but could not close the gap fully. As energy costs rose, the disadvantage of aging infrastructure became more pronounced. Transportation economics also shifted during this period. While Bethlehem Steel had long benefited from established rail connections, changes in freight pricing and logistics practices altered cost assumptions. Shipping steel over long distances became more expensive relative to producers located closer to end markets or ports. This reduced Bethlehem's competitiveness in regions where proximity mattered more than reliability. Customers began factoring transport costs more heavily into sourcing decisions, further narrowing Bethlehem's pricing flexibility. Within management, strategic debates grew more complex. Some advocated aggressive modernization to match foreign competitors, even if it meant short-term financial strain. Others favored preserving cash flow and extending the life of existing assets. These debates did not produce immediate resolution. Instead, they resulted in partial measures that satisfied neither approach fully. Modernization occurred unevenly, leaving some facilities improved while others lagged behind, creating performance disparities within the same company. The workforce experienced these tensions indirectly. Training programs emphasized efficiency and compliance rather than skill expansion. Job roles became more narrowly defined as processes were standardized. Opportunities for advancement narrowed as management focused on cost control rather than growth. While employment levels remained relatively stable for a time, morale became more cautious. Workers sensed that conditions were changing, even if official messaging emphasized continuity. Financial reporting during this phase reflected a company working harder to maintain equilibrium. Revenue remained substantial, but profitability fluctuated. Cash reserves were drawn down during weaker periods to sustain operations. Debt obligations became more visible in planning discussion. Pension and healthcare liabilities continued to grow as the workforce aged, increasing long-term commitments that depended on future performance. External policy responses added another layer of uncertainty. Trade disputes, tariffs, and negotiations aimed at protecting domestic steel producers created temporary relief, but also unpredictability. Short-term protection could stabilize prices, but it did not address underlying cost differences. Planning around policy outcomes became an additional variable in decision-making, complicating long-term strategy. For the town of Bethlehem, these developments translated into subtle but meaningful changes. Employment was still present, but confidence softened. Local investment slowed. Younger residents began considering opportunities elsewhere, sensing that long-term prospects were less certain than they had been for previous generations. The town did not experience immediate decline, but it entered a period of hesitation. By the end of this phase, Bethlehem Steel remained operational and influential, but the conditions supporting its dominance were eroding. The company was expending more effort to maintain position, while gaining less from each contract. The system still held together, but it did so under increasing strain, setting the stage for the more visible disruptions that would follow when external pressures intensified further. The final phase of Bethlehem Steel did not begin with a collapse, an announcement, or a clear moment when everything changed. It began when the company started operating with less room for delay than its systems were designed to handle. Decisions that once had months of buffer now had weeks. Adjustments that could previously be absorbed quietly began showing up in schedules, payroll, and output reports. The steel was still moving, but the margin for error had narrowed enough that every disruption carried visible consequences. Global steel markets were no longer segmented in the way they had been for most of the company's life. Pricing pressure became constant rather than cyclical. Producers operating newer plants in Europe and Asia were able to supply comparable products at lower cost, supported by modern layouts, lower energy consumption, and labor structures that allowed faster adjustment. Bethlehem Steel could not match those conditions without dismantling the very systems that kept it operating. Size, once a source of security, now amplified exposure. Modernization efforts intensified, but they arrived unevenly. Some facilities received upgrades that improved efficiency and reduced operating costs locally. Others continued relying on equipment that had been extended far beyond its original design life. This created internal imbalance. Management resources were increasingly consumed by efforts to keep weaker operations functioning, rather than repositioning the company strategically. Capital flowed toward maintenance and preservation. Employment reductions began appearing in steps rather than waves. Departments were consolidated. Shifts were reduced. Certain job categories disappeared entirely. These changes accumulated over time, altering the experience of work without producing a single defining moment. Early retirements were encouraged, but they increased pension obligations instead of easing financial pressure. Remaining workers faced higher workloads and greater uncertainty, weakening morale even as the company tried to project stability. Financial strain became harder to obscure. Cash flow fluctuated sharply with market conditions. Debt servicing absorbed a growing share of operating income. Pension and healthcare liabilities expanded as the workforce aged and employment levels declined. The company was no longer generating enough surplus to comfortably support obligations built during decades of expansion. Each financial decision addressed immediate needs while limiting future flexibility. The town of Bethlehem experienced these shifts gradually but unmistakably. Businesses that had depended on consistent steel wages saw customer traffic thin. public budgets tightened as tax revenue softened. Community institutions that had grown alongside the steelworks began scaling back. Younger residents increasingly sought opportunities elsewhere, changing the town's demographic profile and weakening intergenerational continuity. Management strategies during this phase reflected constrained choices. Asset sales generated temporary relief but reduced productive capacity. Mergers and restructuring promised efficiency gains without resolving structural cost disadvantages. Trade protections provided brief stabilization while introducing policy uncertainty that complicated long-term planning. None of these measures restored the conditions that had once supported dominance. As production contracted further, entire sections of the steelworks went offline. Furnaces that had operated continuously for generations were shut down. Rolling mills slowed and then stopped. Maintenance priorities shifted from optimization to preservation. Each shutdown reduced operational complexity while also shrinking the company's ability to generate revenue, reinforcing the downward cycle. For workers, the end did not arrive as a single event. It arrived through absence, fewer posted schedules, familiar routines interrupted, colleagues leaving without replacement. The system that had once required constant coordination now struggled to justify keeping parts of itself running at all. Eventually, continued operations ceased to be viable. Bankruptcy formalized a reality that had already been unfolding through years of contraction. Bethlehem Steel's role as a major industrial producer ended not because steel was no longer needed, but because the structure built to produce it no longer aligned with the environment in which it operated. After production stopped, the physical remains of the steelworks stood as evidence of the system that had sustained the town for generations. Massive structures designed for continuous motion sat idle. Equipment that had shaped national infrastructure became static. The transition from operation to absence was gradual, but its impact was permanent. The end of Bethlehem Steel was not the result of a single failure or decision. It reflected the limits of a system built for permanence in a world that began valuing flexibility, cost efficiency, and speed above continuity. The company fed cities, sustained families, and shaped regions for decades. When it ended, it left behind a clear record of how industrial systems built for one era struggle when the conditions that supported them change beyond their capacity to adjust. As that adjustment unfolded, what disappeared was not only production capacity, but the certainty that had once defined daily life in Bethlehem.